Ranged fire combat represents the exchange of musket, rifle, and artillery fire between the opposing sides. Now, in general, the rule sets agree on this in most respects, so I'll only point out the differences that come up as we move along. They both agree that fire is conducted at a hex rather than at a specific unit, but we will see that the target unit does have an impact on how fire is conducted and resolved. Fire is conducted by an attacker at a defender. The formation and facing of the attacker is important. Attackers may only fire through their front facing hex sides. We already went through all of that with movement. So this is another consequence of formation and facing. Another aspect is the strength of the attacking unit, how many increments of strength it can bring to bear. And these things are brought together in the form of the fire effects chart to yield the combat value for the attack. This is the fire effects charts for Lutzen. We see the branch of the unit here, the nationality, and then the type of unit. And we see the formation and the fire effects for each. We'll go over each in detail, but this is what drives the combat factor that's brought to bear when an attacking unit conducts a fire attack. Similar aspects are in play in defense. So a defending unit has a formation and a facing. They occupy terrain, clear terrain, or cultivated town, whatever the terrain occupied by them might be. They have a strength, a number of increments in the hex, and that is all brought together to yield the defense factor of that target, and we find that on the fire defense chart. This is the fire defense chart from Lutzen. We see the branch on the far left here, and the specific formation, and the terrain across the top. We just cross-index our formation with our branch and our terrain and get the value that is the defense factor for that particular target. Now let's look at each of these in a little more detail. We already talked about how column is a formation very good for maneuvering. The French happen to use it quite a bit for attacking as well. They would conduct fire combats. But for the purposes of an attack factor, the value of the attack factor is going to be the value printed on the specific side of the counter. So this French unit has a 6 for its combat factor for column. Zoom in there a little bit. There are other pieces of information here. We already looked at the morale. This top number here is the printed or column attack factor. That same value actually also applies for general order combats as well. So we have the Prussian unit here in the town in general order, and they also happen to have a 6 as their factor. Now the assignment of that factor is much like all the other qualities we've talked about in the past. It's going to be based on the unit type, the branch, the doctrine of the nationality, the training and experience, and so on. So the title designers will assign those values as they see fit. Now a column or general order can fire with that full attack factor right up until they are down to their last increment of strength. So when this 8 increment strength battalion gets 7 casualties, he will then cut that combat factor in half, that fire factor. So that just represents the frontage presented by the column, I suppose. Now in defense, we would look up on the fire defense chart that we just saw, and we would find that in clear terrain, a column has a defense factor of 6. A general order, like in a town, has a defense factor of, in this game, it's 20. It's a very high defense factor. Of course, it means that they're dispersed among the buildings and hard to find as a target. Now in defense, the strength or the size of the unit factors into its eventual outcome as well. While this unit might have a 6 for fire attack, and this unit might have a 6 for defense, he's actually at a great disadvantage because he has 27 increments. That's basically a gigantic mass of men crammed into this relatively small area. So what the systems do is that they apply a dice roll bonus of 1 for every increment above 9. So you can see having 27 increments in one hex gives you a gigantic bonus when you fire on that hex. You're much more likely to cause a casualty. These units are in line formation, opposing each other here. Line formation has a different way of determining the attack factor. Essentially, you can take up to 4 increments of strength per hex, and you use those 4 increments and you multiply it by the value from the fire effects chart to yield the fire strength coming out of that hex. So quickly we'll look at that. Was a French line battalion we were looking at. They are in line formation. They have a multiplier of ×2, which is really pretty poor. It means these are not very good troops the French have on the field this day. So if we take 4 increments from this hex, multiply it by 2, we get a final fire combat value of 8. So we'd be firing 8 factors against that defending hex. Now, different units will have different multipliers. We looked those up on the fire defense chart, fire effects chart, and figure them differently. So this, I think these are Baden troops. They might have, a worse, or maybe even better, depending on. Actually, now I look at it, it is better. They get a ×3 multiplier. So these German troops are better than these French. And the Prussians would have their own as well. So we have this 4th battalion here in one hex. Even though he has 7 increments, he can only fire 4. Effectively, that's all the men he can bring to bear in the firing line. The rest are back behind them in a sort of reserve. So if you have large battalions that can span more than one hex, in line formation, it's a benefit to you. It increases your overall fire that you can get out of that unit. The fire defense of a unit in line is again found on the fire defense chart. So we can see here that infantry in line, in clear, has a 9 defense factor. And I can also see that they're able to form line in cultivated hexes with a slightly higher defense factor. So if I were to fire this unit against that one, I have 2 hexes. I could fire 1 hex against each of his hexes, or I could combine my fire on 2 hexes onto 1 here, whatever I thought gave me the best attack possibility. So since these are a ×2 multiplier, I know that I can get 8 fire factors out against a hex. I know that this is a 9, so I'm already at a disadvantage unless I combine my fires. Now a line with more than 6 increments, I think it's 6, maybe it's 5, but a large enough line in one hex actually diminishes the fire defense. So it's usually 2 less than what it was. Oh no, no, it is going to be the fire defense of a column when it's in one hex with too many increments. So this would not be a 9, this would be a 6 in the Lutzen game. So again, stacking up many increments in one hex can make you a very good target for your opponent. And again, the dice multiplier for every increment above 9 applies as well. Another change is that if the enemy is able to attack the flank hex of a line, that gives that hex the defense of a column as well. So fire coming in, essentially down the length of a line is more effective than straight on. Quick correction, yes, I said dice multiplier, but I meant dice modifier for increments above 9 in a single hex. Skirmish mode is that dispersed presentation that infantry and cavalry can give. Since I mentioned cavalry basically as targets are under the same structure as infantry. They just have different defense factors on the charts. For the most part, they can only fire as skirmishers, but we'll cover those later under their specific segment. So these skirmishers, occupying these two hexes here, fire in a way that's similar to a line in that we take the number of increments in the hex with a maximum of 3 and then multiply that number by the multiplier to get the fire attack factor. We'll look at the Prussians for a change. So those Prussian Fusiliers in skirmish order can also fire at ×2. So kind of across the board in this battle, the fire combat is pretty poor. Not very good for any of the armies. So if we had 3 increments here and 3 increments there, we could multiply by their multiplier and then fire both of these hexes on the one hex here of that formation. Remembering that we fire through our front facing, that means that the skirmisher can actually fire in this long arc here. So if they were here like this, that's a front hex side, and they could fire sort of diagonally there at the Prussians. Now in defense, skirmishers usually have much higher defense factors because they're assumed to be spread out and it's just a harder target. Of course, that will always vary by game, or title rather, and in general, it'll be higher than a line or the column. I think it's basically impossible to get a gigantic skirmish unit in one hex, so you're rarely going to have that dice modifier for the greater than 9 increments in a hex. Square formation is slightly different from the others. This is this formation that really presents kind of an all-around facing. Literally, it's a square on the field. And even with all-around facing, however, it can't fire into all of the hexes. It's actually limited to firing at every other hex in its zone here. The 5th edition rulebook has a good picture here. It's kind of like a triangle representing the square inside of a hexagon. So if you were to fire on a target here, you can only fire on targets in non-adjacent hexes. So fire here, can't fire there or there. Of course, if I were to have chosen to fire here at a target, well then we would just pivot our triangle around and then every other non-adjacent hex would be able to be fired upon. Units in square total all of the increments in the square and then multiply that by their fire effects multiplier to come up with their fire factor. Now, because they are firing in only non-adjacent hexes, they can only use a portion of their fire factor for each hex, essentially a third. So if we have 8 increments here in this square, which we do, and let's suppose to make it easy on myself, let's suppose their multiplier was 3, they'd have a fire factor of 24, but it would be divided by 3, one for each of the possible targets. Now it's divided by 3 whether or not they fire 3 times or not. It's just representing the fact that this formation is facing in all different ways, so not everyone is facing in any one particular direction. Now for defense, it's a very compact formation that also has essentially multiple ranks every direction you're firing, and so that makes it a very good target, which means it has a very low fire defense. Apparently I don't remember my Lutzen very well because the defense of a square is a 6. And 6 is actually fairly good. It's equal to a column, but in many titles the square defense is somewhere around a 4, just indicating that it's very vulnerable to fire attack. And like any formation, the more increments you have stacked in your square, the more dangerous it is for the unit. It also has the dice modifier for increments above 9. The involuntary formations can be the target of fire combat, but only the disorder formation can actually conduct a fire combat. His attack value is going to be the printed value, or the column value, divided by 2. So basically half the number of fire factors normally available in column. In defense, they generally have a very high defense factor, especially for the Plusquam disorder, because they're not well formed anymore and don't make very good targets. I suppose it probably represents a little bit of the presumed motion of those guys trying to escape. I sure don't remember my Lutzen very well. So disorder isn't really that big a number, 8. Plusquam disorder is a little higher at 14, but generally these are in the 14 to 16 range, most of the titles. So it makes them a little harder to shoot at, get a good result. Now unlimbered artillery can also fire, and of course that's its purpose. But it fires a little differently. It has a range, and we're going to talk about range a little later, but when looking at the counters and understanding the fire factors, we have to understand range a little bit. So every artillery unit has its specific ratings. We know what 1 or 2 of those are, the morale factor there. But in the top right, we have a number that is the long range, essentially the maximum effective range of this artillery unit. The numbers on the left here represent the fire factors. Now the range of an artillery unit is essentially broken down into 3 plus 1 categories. Short range is 1 to 2 hexes away. Medium range is 3 to 5 hexes distance. And long range is 6 and more, up to the maximum range of the unit, hexes away. So that means an artillery unit can engage at a fairly long range in this game system. So the first number here is the short range attack value. The middle is the medium range, and the bottom is the long range. Now the 5th edition has something that's called extreme range, and effectively it is 1.5 times the range number printed on the unit. That is particular to the 5th edition Premier. It does not have that. So when they fire with the appropriate factor for the range that they are firing from. So if this guy is firing here, that's 2 hexes away, that would be short range. He would fire with 16 factors. And then of course the defense of the target is whatever it is. Now if we were to move this guy right there next to him, that's also short range, but it's also considered very short range. It's canister range. So when an artillery fires canister, they get a bonus on the fire combat resolution in their favor that makes them more effective. Something particular to the 5th edition is something called ricochet. If you're firing an artillery unit at medium, long, or extra, or extreme range, there's this notion that the ball fires, strikes the target, but then keeps traveling behind it. And there's a distance in which it'll travel, and the damage it does is reflected, by this ricochet rule. And essentially you can conduct fire combats at units behind the target on a line from the artillery. That is particular to Premier. That is not present in, it's particular to the 5th edition. It is not present in Premier. Up until now, we've just been firing units at each other. But now we have to introduce the leaders, because leaders in La Bataille can affect the combat for artillery. One of the leader bonuses on his specific side is an artillery bonus. We've already seen the morale bonus. We know we use that to affect the morale tests. In a very similar fashion, we use the leader bonus for artillery to affect attacks made by artillery. So this general can increase the effectiveness by 1, and that is added to the dice that are rolled to resolve the fire combat. The 5th edition has a few other things we'll get to in a minute for artillery, but I think we're going to talk about ammunition first. In the Premier rules, you can shoot all the artillery you want. For that matter, you can shoot all the musketry you want as well. No effects felt by, extreme exchanges of gunfire. In the 5th edition, however, there is the concept of artillery ammunition. So effectively, most kinds of artillery fire consume a point of artillery ammunition. And when you run out of ammunition, you have run out of the ability to fire. So managing the ammunition for the artillery batteries is important if you want to keep them firing effectively. As part of that, there are special units called artillery ammunition wagons, and they are there to hold the ammunition. Now, I learned this backwards, unfortunately. The rules now tell me that I should put a marker, an increment marker, under the ammunition wagon for every shot I expend when I fire my artillery. But unfortunately, I learned to show the wagon as being full with a full 6 shots, and then when I expended one, I would decrement it to 5, and so on, down to 0. But anyway, you represent the amount of artillery ammunition available in these wagons. When the wagons are depleted, there's a mechanism for resupplying those wagons, and therefore keeping your artillery supplied. Now some of the 5th edition only artillery chrome. First we have the notion of leaders of special ability. We'll see that again in cavalry, but in artillery, certain leaders will be given credit for their prowess at handling artillery, and they can do things like create a grand battery. A grand battery essentially is a park of artillery commanded by that special leader, and it allows him to combine fires and then affect that fire with his outstanding artillery bonus like the Emperor has here. But when we saw that artillery action chit, and I said, I don't really think we need this anymore. Well, one of the benefits of it is that you can use it to fire this grand battery, essentially a special extra time in a turn. So they could fire during their fire phase and then one time more in that artillery chit action phase. There are also special types of artillery that can be present in a particular title. Essentially they're howitzers, and they can fire indirect fire. Everything we've looked at right now has been direct fire. You have to be able to see what you're shooting at. Indirect fire gives you the opportunity to shoot at something you can't necessarily see. If it's within range, and there are rules around this, but suppose I could fire at this unit way over there behind the orchards. The indirect fire would let me do that. Which I guess segues nicely into that concept of line of sight. These are linear tactics. Everybody's shooting at each other. Generally they're shooting at what they can see. There are rules for determining when you can see something and when you can't. It's generally controlled by the facing of the unit. You can see something in your front, you can't see it out of your back or flanks. Also, terrain. If something is in your way, you can't see through it. Can't see through a town. And also, units can be in the way and obstruct your vision. I'm not sure if there's any other topic that would cause as many fistfights as determining line of sight on a game table, but that's as far as I'm going to take it. Good luck figuring out your own lines of sight. When does fire occur? Now, the specifics of the sequence of play we're going to save to a later segment, but basically both rule sets agree that the fire phases occur after the movement of units. So when a side moves their units, at the conclusion of that movement, the opposing side is then able to deliver a defensive fire on any targets that they can. And when that's completed, the moving player is able to conclude any offensive fires that are possible. Defensive fires must be conducted at adjacent targets only. In general, infantry units have 1 hex range for all their combats. Artillery, we already know, has multiple ranges, short, medium, and long. But additionally, skirmishers generally have a 2 hex range. Some titles will have skirmishers with out to 3 hexes of range, given that they're rifle armed. But for the most part, it's 2 at the most. Now, defensive fire can only be conducted against adjacent targets. So if the French were to have moved here, and then the Prussians were to have engaged in the defensive fire, this skirmisher can only fire at that battalion, not at this one because it's 2 hexes. Similarly, if the Prussians had moved and it was the French defensive fire, this artillery could not fire because it's not adjacent, nor could this skirmisher, since he has no adjacent targets. Offensive fire can make use of the fullest range permitted for a unit. So if the the French were to conduct their offensive fire, these units could fire because they're adjacent. The artillery could fire because it's within range, but additionally this skirmisher could fire because 2 hexes is within his range. There's another kind of fire combat that occurs during movement. Whenever a moving unit expends movement points in the zone of influence of an opposing side, that can trigger an opportunity fire. Now, infantry is locked into a hex when they're in a zone of influence, but they could change formation. So this unit could change formation, expending movement points, and that unit could fire upon them. If I could find a leader here. Suppose we were careless enough to put Napoleon in the front line there. If this unit wanted to leave the zone of influence, when they exit it, that would be an expenditure of movement points and therefore trigger an opportunity fire. Remember, in the 5th edition rule, a leader must be present to leave a zone of influence. And also remember that changing orientation or facing in the premier rules expends movement points. So that would cause an opportunity attack. So think how penal that could be, that if I were here, I wanted to retreat that battalion, first I'd have to change facing, that's one opportunity, and then I'd have to move to leave the hex, and that's a second opportunity fire attack. As we hinted at before, when that action chit is drawn in the 5th edition, that allows grand batteries and indirect guns to fire a special extra fire. So what are the results of all this firing? Well, essentially we're going to be trying to inflict casualties as well as morale tests on the enemy. This is a pretty old copy of the fire combat chart. Essentially it lists all of the possible outcomes for combats. You can see they're just all numbers. Those are casualties inflicted on the target. It's kind of stylized. The font is a little hard to read actually at a distance. but this content has remained the same since the very first game. This is the chart from Linney. You can see it's a little cleaner, a little easier to read, but the values and the outcomes are identical to that original chart. And here's a chart from the Premier side. Again, easier to read, a little more clear, but the values are identical. So ultimately there are really three outcomes to, or maybe four I guess I should say, to fire combat. One is no casualty, just a miss, no effect. The second is one or more casualties inflicted on the target. The third is casualties inflicted on the target and a morale test. This is an example of a chart listing when units check morale due to fire combat losses. So it's generally broken down by nationality, type of unit, the branch, and it will usually have something along the lines of every even numbered increment loss, every third increment loss, something to represent how often those particular units will have to check their morale when they suffer a casualty. Now some are weaker troops and they have to check every single time. Others are more stout, and like the guard infantry here, and they only check every third loss. Inflicting an increment is kind of hard, so a loss is kind of hard, so that number of checks really makes a big difference in how long the unit can stand in the combat. Now the fourth is a casualty along with a leader casualty. So if you get a result, this table just highlighted in red in this area, that means any leader present is also subject to a casualty. And there are rules to determine priority if you have more than one leader in the hex, but basically it means they can be subject to a wound that would keep them out of the battle for a period, or even a mortal injury that would take them out completely. Now, this kind of losses apply equally to infantry and cavalry, or limbered artillery, but unlimbered artillery is a little different. When fired upon, they only sustain a casualty for even numbered results. So that means if we were to fire upon this artillery unit here and achieve a 1 casualty result, there would be no effect on that artillery. If that artillery were stacked with infantry and we were to fire on them and achieve that 1 loss, the infantry would actually absorb that loss. Now if we were to fire on that artillery stack and achieve 2 casualties, one of the casualties would go to the artillery and the infantry would absorb the other casualty. So it basically, even numbered casualties are assigned to the artillery, and odd number are assigned to any accompanying infantry. But of course the 5th edition adds a little bit to that. There's this notion of suppression on an artillery. If they're fired upon by another artillery unit, and suppose they incur a 1 casualty, even if they're alone, that means that the target takes no losses, but they're effectively suppressed, meaning they can no longer conduct a fire attack for the remainder of the turn. Usually you mark them with something to indicate that they're suppressed, and then they cannot fire in their own opportunity. How do we conduct a fire attack? Well, we know about attack strength, defense strength, and we know about range. So basically we just, in our segment where we can conduct an attack, we determine the attack strength that we're going to direct at the target hex. We determine the defense strength of that target hex, and then we divide the attack by the defense to form a ratio, an odds ratio. And we always round down in favor of the defender. What that really means is if we discover a ratio of 1 to 2.2, rounding down, worse for the attack would be to 1 to 2.5. That's in favor of the defense. Now we have our charts. We know they have an odds ratio at the top and dice along the side. So we take our ratio, find it on the table, we would roll some dice, and then that would be our result. So in this case, the dice are the same as they were in morale when we talked about that. They're basically a base 6-ish kind of dice. So the number here is not a 4, it's a 13. We take the left die, multiply by 10, and add the right die. So if we were to cross-reference on our chart there, we could see that 13 is not going to cause a casualty until we have 4 to 1 odds. So that's a very high odds attack. But if we were to roll something like a 63, we could see that that causes quite a few casualties here. Basically all the way down to a 1 to 2 attack would create a casualty with a roll of 63. So after we found our result, we would apply it to the target unit, conduct any morale tests that might be necessary, and if a leader is a casualty, we'd roll for the damage to that leader. The Linny actually has it kind of nicely laid out here. You roll 1 die, and you figure out the result, and then if it's a wound, you roll 2 dice to figure out how long they'll be out, or actually 1 or 2 die, depending on the type of the wound. So we conduct that process for every single fire combat we want to undertake. We can see that there's a lot of blank space, especially in the lower odds attacks, which means it can be really hard to inflict a casualty. So you can imagine if you have a very large battle with a line of forces engaged across the breadth of the map, and you start resolving fire combats along the line, that's a lot of dice rolling, a lot of figuring factors and ratios, and given the structure of the combat chart, a lot of misses. So there's a technique that a lot of people use to speed this up a little bit, and that is just to roll dice. You roll the dice, you eyeball them. If you think they're high enough, then you go to the bother of checking to see whether or not the odds ratio will produce a result on the combat chart. So it makes the process go a little faster. Sometimes you roll a lot of dice without getting any casualties, but you will still have quite a bit of activity that actually results in casualties. I think the mechanics are straightforward enough. There's no question that the presentation of the different formations and branches of service and the different unit types give a lot of that flair and feel of the period that I think many of us like so much. But ultimately, is it worth the bother? There are quite a number of folks who think that fire combat is a complete waste of time. I guess the reason I wanted to go over this is because I'm in the camp that thinks it's definitely worthwhile. I think it represents the grind of the battle, and I think it represents at a pretty good pace. I don't want nuclear strikes taking out entire units every 20 minutes. I think it's appropriate for there to be casualties spread out over time. What I'm really going for in fire combat isn't the loss of strength as much as it is the morale tests. The more morale tests I can cause, the greater the chances are that I'm going to significantly disrupt and dislocate my enemy. Every time I can get a casualty that causes a morale test, get somebody to retreat, I open a hole in the line, I force him to commit some reserves, keeps him from doing something somewhere else he wants to do. The fact that every fire combat isn't decisive in that way, I think, is appropriate for the time scale that we're looking at here. But even if we were to consider getting rid of ranged fire combat, we still have to balance the game with something to replace what we're losing there. And maybe that means altering our close-in combat. But again, I'm not a big fan of making any one kind of combat too decisive. I want to see the things occur in the correct time frame. I think at the beginning of the battle we shouldn't have a total collapse in a few turns with massive casualties. That's definitely something that should be represented over the span of the game. So we see that sort of thing happening late after a long process of wearing down the enemy. So that's my case for fire combat being vital to the system. I know there are different opinions and different approaches to maybe even making it a little faster, but I'm comfortable with it as it is. I like the representation of the period, and I think it still maintains the kind of balance I like to see in the play. That said, artillery ricochet is something I can do without. That truly does take up a lot of time and dice rolling for a very small effect. Occasionally something occurs that's worth it, but for the most part I just feel like I spend too much time tracking the ricochet without really seeing the results in the long term. But when I get Ligny on the table, I'm definitely going to play artillery ricochet.